Welcome to my channel.
The rain in Lochdubh did not fall so much as it drifted, a fine grey haar that blurred the peaks of the mountains and turned the sea loch into a basin of cold lead. It was the sort of Highland weather that encouraged a man to stay by his stove, and PC Hamish Macbeth was doing exactly that. He sat in his kitchen at the police station, his long, lanky frame draped over a wooden chair that had seen better decades. His shock of ginger hair was uncombed, and his hazel eyes were fixed dreamily on a pot of coffee that was beginning to fill the room with a comforting aroma. At his feet lay Lugs, a dog of uncertain pedigree and enormous ears, who let out a soft, sympathetic woof. "Aye, Lugs," Hamish murmured, his voice a soft Highland lilt. "It's an indoor day. If the superintendent calls, we'll just pretend the lines are down from the gale." It wouldn't be a lie exactly, they're always thinking of coming down. Hamish's primary ambition in life was to remain exactly where he was, the police constable of a village where nothing ever happened, or at least nothing he couldn't handle with a quiet word and a bit of common sense. Promotion was a threat to be avoided at all costs. To the brass in Strathbane he was a lazy, unambitious tuchter. Hamish did nothing to disabuse them of this notion, it was his greatest shield. The peace was punctured by the aggressive roar of a high-performance engine. Hamish sighed. Only an outsider would drive that fast on the single-track roads of Sutherland. He rose and wandered to the window. A silver Porsche, glistening with raindrops like a sleek metallic beetle, had pulled up outside the general store. Outstepped a man who looked like he had been vacuum-sealed into a designer tweed jacket. He was tan, the sort of tan that cost a great deal of money to maintain in November, and he moved with the impatient, jerky energy of a man who found the passage of time in the north to be a personal insult. This was Julian Vane, the Sassenach who had recently purchased the Larches, a grand Victorian pile on the edge of the village. Vane was a property developer from London who had arrived 3 weeks ago with a mission to modernize Lochdubh. He had already managed to offend the postmistress by complaining about the speed of the mail, and had nearly been hexed by the local witches for suggesting that the loch was under-leveraged as a tourist asset. Hamish watched through the glass as Vane shouted into a mobile phone, his voice carrying through the damp air. "I don't care about the planning permission, Nigel. These people are primitives. A few cases of cheap whiskey and they'll sign anything." Hamish took a slow sip of his coffee. "He's got no manners, Lugs," he whispered. "And in a place like this, manners are the only thing keeping the knives in the drawers." Vane slammed his car door and marched toward the grocery, nearly slipping on the slick cobbles. He let out a loud theatrical curse that echoed across the quiet waterfront. Mrs. Kennedy, hanging a sodden rug nearby, gave him a look that would have curdled fresh cream. Hamish turned back to his stove, a small, uneasy feeling prickling at the back of his neck. Lochdubh was a village that could swallow a great deal, rain, sheep, and the occasional scandal, but it did not digest arrogance well. "I'll give him a week," Hamish told the dog. "Maybe 2 if he stops shouting, but men like that, they never stop shouting until someone makes them." He reached for a biscuit, settling back into his chair. He had every intention of staying there until the sun went down, or at least until the coffee ran out. But as the wind rattled the window pane, he couldn't shake the feeling that Julian Vane's modernization of Lochdubh was about to take a very dark, very permanent turn. The peace Hamish so dearly cherished lasted exactly until the following morning. He had managed to spend the rest of that grey Tuesday avoiding any further sight of Julian Vane, occupying himself with the gentle art of poaching a small grilse from the lower pools of the Ndup. It was a victimless crime in Hamish's eyes, as the local laird, Colonel Halberton Smythe, had more fish than he knew what to do with, and Hamish's stomach had a persistent, nagging emptiness that only a fresh fillet and a bit of butter could satisfy. But by Wednesday at 8 o'clock, the damp Highland air carried a different sort of chill, one that had nothing to do with the mist rising off the heather. Hamish was standing over his stove, the smell of frying fish mingling with the scent of his 4th pot of coffee, when the station door was nearly kicked off its hinges. It wasn't the polite, tentative knock of a villager looking to report a stray sheep. This was the frantic, percussive thumping of a man who had seen something that had shaken his very soul. Hamish sighed, set down his spatula, and opened the door to find Archie McLean, the local handyman and professional grumbler, standing there with his cap clutched in trembling hands. Archie's face, usually a robust shade of sunset purple from years of cheap cider, was now a sickly, mottled grey. "It's the Sassenach, Hamish," Archie gasped, his breath coming in ragged plumes of white. "The one in the fancy car. Up at the Larches. I went up to fix a leak in his roof. The man's been harping on it since he arrived, and I found him, or what's left of him." Hamish felt a familiar weight settle in his chest. It was the weight of impending paperwork, the roar of DCI Blair's voice, and the inevitable loss of his quiet life. "Is he dead, Archie? Truly dead? Not just sleeping off a heavy bottle of gin? He's as dead as the Covenanters," Archie squeaked, leaning against the doorframe for support. "And it's no a pretty sight, Hamish. He's in the garden, in the fountain, but there's no water in it, just him." Hamish grabbed his peaked cap, which sat crookedly on his ginger hair, and whistled for Lugs. The dog, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, abandoned his spot by the stove and trotted toward the door, his oversized ears flopping with every step. Hamish paused only long enough to turn off the gas under his fish. A man could not think of a burnt breakfast, and then followed Archie up the winding, potholed track that led to Julian Vane's estate. The Larches was a sprawling, overly ornate house that looked profoundly uncomfortable in its surroundings, like a ballroom dancer lost in a peat bog. As they rounded the gravel driveway, Hamish saw the silver Porsche parked exactly where it had been the day before, its sleek lines now covered in a layer of pine needles and grit. But it was the ornamental fountain in the centre of the turning circle that commanded his attention. It was a hideous thing, featuring a marble Neptune that Varnon had likely imported from an auction house in the south. Julian Vane was there, but he was no longer shouting about planning permission. He was slumped over the edge of the dry basin, his designer tweed jacket hiked up around his ears. His head was submerged in a pile of decorative white quartz pebbles at the bottom of the fountain. There was no blood, which was the first thing Hamish noted, but the man's posture was impossibly contorted. One arm was extended toward the house, while the other was tucked beneath him. Most bizarre of all, a large stuffed salmon, the kind found in a glass case in a pub, had B.N. shoved down the back of his trousers. The wooden plaque still attached. "Lord preserve us," Hamish muttered, rubbing his chin. It was a death that was simultaneously grim and deeply humiliating. Someone had not only killed Julian Vane, but had seen fit to mock him in the process. Hamish knelt by the fountain, his long limbs folding like a lawn chair. He didn't touch the body. He knew better than to disturb the scene before the experts arrived to ruin it. But he looked. He looked at the scuff marks in the gravel, which suggested a struggle that had been brief and brutal. He looked at the way Van's expensive leather loafers were missing their laces, and he looked at the victim's face, which was frozen in an expression of indignant surprise, as if he were about to demand to speak to the manager of the afterlife. Lugs began to whimper, sniffing at a patch of rhododendrons a few yards away. Hamish rose and followed the dog. There, discarded in the dirt, was a heavy iron fireplace poker. It was clean, wiped down by the rain or a careful hand, but it looked out of place in the garden. "He was an arrogant man, Hamish," Archie whispered, having found his voice again. "He told me yesterday I was a relic of a dying age. He said he was going to turn the village hall into a boutique gin distillery. Arrogance is not a capital offence, Archie, though in Lochdubh it comes close," Hamish replied softly. He looked back at the body. The inclusion of the stuffed salmon was a touch of local theatre that pointed directly at the village, a silent cry of resentment from a community that felt pushed too far. Hamish pulled his notebook from his pocket, though he didn't write anything yet. He was listening, not to the wind or the distant cry of a gull, but to the silence of the house. The Larches felt hollow, yet he sensed the eyes of the village beginning to turn toward this hill. News travelled faster than light in the Highlands. By now the postmistress would be telling the minister, and the minister would be telling his wife. The peace of Lochdubh hadn't just been shattered, it had been ground into the dirt under a designer heel. Hamish knew that within hours, the road from Strathbane would be choked with police cars, and his kitchen would be invaded by men who didn't understand that a man's secrets are often found in what he leaves out of his stories, not what he puts in them. He took a deep breath of the cold, pine-scented air, savouring his last moment of autonomy. "Aye, Lugs," he said, patting the dog's head. "The holiday is over. We'd best get the tea brewing. We're going to have company, and they won't be the sort who bring their own biscuits." As if on cue, the distant, discordant wail of a siren began to echo through the glen, growing louder as it bounced off the granite walls of the mountains. DCI Blair was coming, and with him, the end of Hamish's quiet morning. The investigation had begun, not with a bang, but with the ridiculous sight of a dead man and a wooden fish. And Hamish Macbeth knew that before this was over, he would have to find a way to solve the murder without letting anyone realize just how clever he actually was. The sirens did not merely approach, they assaulted the silence of the glen, a jagged, electronic screaming that sent a flock of crows erupting from the pines like a cloud of soot. Hamish stood by the fountain, his hands deep in the pockets of his salt-and-pepper greatcoat, watching as a fleet of white and blue patrol cars skidded onto the gravel of the larches. At the head of the convoy was a black sedan that pulled up with such unnecessary aggression it sprayed a fan of wet grit over Hamish's boots. Out stepped Detective Chief Inspector Blair, a man whose physical presence was defined by a neck that seemed to have been swallowed by his collar, and a face that remained a permanent, pulsating shade of boiled beetroot. Blair slammed his door and marched toward the fountain, his eyes narrowing as they landed on the lanky, unkempt figure of the village constable. Behind him trailed his sycophantic shadow, Detective Sergeant Anderson, who was already fumbling with a digital camera and looking as though he'd rather be anywhere else. Blair didn't offer a greeting. He didn't even acknowledge the drizzling rain that was currently soaking into his cheap suit. He simply pointed a thick, trembling finger at Hamish's chest. "You!" Blair roared, his voice echoing off the Victorian stonework of the house. "Macbeth, I'd have known I'd find you standing around like a decorative garden gnome while a crime scene goes to pot. Why haven't you cordoned this off? Why are there civilian footprints all over the gravel? Look at you, you look like you've just crawled out of a haystack." Hamish assumed his most vacant, wide-eyed expression, the one he reserved specifically for high-ranking officers from Strathbane. It was a look of profound, rustic stupidity that had served him well for years. "I was just waiting for the experts, sir," Hamish said, his Highland accent becoming more pronounced, thick as double cream. "Archie McLean here found the poor soul, and I thought it best not to disturb the arrangements. It's a delicate matter. As you can see," Blair shoved past Hamish, nearly knocking Lugs over. The dog let out a low growl, which Hamish silenced with a subtle tap of his toe. Blair reached the fountain's edge and stopped dead. He stared down at the contorted body of Julian Vane, his eyes bulging as they settled on the stuffed salmon protruding from the dead man's trousers. For a moment, the DCI was actually speechless, a rare occurrence that Hamish found briefly delightful. "Is that a fish?" Blair sputtered, his voice jumping an octave. "A wooden taxidermied fish?" "Aye, sir," Hamish replied helpfully. "It looks to be a record-breaking hen fish from the 90s, if the plaque is anything to go by. I belong to the hotel bar, I believe. Or it did until last night." Blair turned on him, his face darkening to a dangerous purple. "I don't care about the provenance of the bloody wildlife, Macbeth. This is a mockery. This is a deliberate insult to the police force. This Vane fellow was a big player in London. Important people are going to be asking questions, and I find him face down in a pebble garden with a trophy fish up his backside." He whirled around to Anderson. "Get the tape up, get the photographer over here, and get this local loon away from the body before he accidentally eats the evidence." Hamish retreated a few paces, drawing Archie McLean with him. He watched as the forensic team, looking like clumsy astronauts in their white Tyvek suits, began to swarm the fountain. They moved with a clinical efficiency that Hamish knew would miss the point entirely. They would look for DNA, for fibres, and for fingerprints, but they wouldn't look at the way the salmon had been positioned, tucked in with a sort of grim theatrical care that suggested the killer hadn't just been angry, but had wanted the entire village to share in the joke. "It's an obvious job, Anderson," Blair shouted, ignoring the fact that the sergeant was standing right next to him. "Look at the victim. Vane was an outsider, a developer. He comes in here, rubs the peasants the wrong way, and one of them snaps. It's probably a property dispute. Who did he argue with last? That's our man. It'll be some bearded Highlander with a grudge and a blood alcohol level that would fail a breathalyze." Our test. Blair's eyes locked onto Archie McLean, who was still trembling and clutching his cap. You! Handyman! You found him, did you? Expecting a payout, were you? Or maybe he refused to pay your extortionate rates for fixing a shingle. I never, Archie stammered, his knees knocking. I just came to fix the lead work, Inspector. I swear on the books. Save it for the station, Blair sneered, waving a hand dismissively. Macbeth, take this man down to the village and keep him under guard. Not that you're capable of guarding a ham sandwich, but try to keep him from fleeing to the hills. I'm going to go through this house and find the paper trail that leads to the killer. This isn't some mystery, you ginger oaf. It's simple mathematics. Money plus motive equals a collar. Hamish nodded obediently, though his mind was already moving far ahead of Blair's blunt force logic. He noticed something the DCI had stepped over in his rush to insult Archie. Near the base of the fountain, partially obscured by a discarded police equipment bag, was a small, bright yellow piece of plastic. It looked like the tail of a toy, perhaps a miniature submarine or a boat. It was a child's plaything, entirely out of place in the sterile, high-design garden of a bachelor like Julian Vane. "Move!" Blair barked, seeing Hamish lingering. "Go play at being a policeman somewhere else. I have a real investigation to run, and I don't need a shepherd getting in the way of my forensics." Hamish Ed his cap, his expression a mask of humble compliance. "Of course, sir. You'll be wanting to handle the heavy lifting. I'll just take Archie back to the station and see if I can find him a cup of tea to settle his nerves. It's a terrible shock for a Lochdubh man, seeing such a waste of a good fish." As he led Archie away, Hamish felt Blair's contemptuous gaze burning into his back. The DCI was already barking orders at his team, convinced that the case was a matter of simple local thuggery. But as Hamish looked back one last time at the grand, cold facade of the Larches, he knew Blair was wrong. The stuffed salmon, the missing shoelaces, and that tiny yellow fragment of plastic told a story that didn't involve property deeds or unpaid bills. It was a story of a much more intimate, much pettier kind of malice. And to find the truth, Hamish wouldn't need a forensic lab. He would need to start mooching, and he would need to start now. He steered Archie toward the village, his mind already calculating which house would have the freshest scones and the most frequent visitors. The hunt had begun, and as usual the official police were heading in exactly the wrong direction. By the time Hamish had deposited a still-shaking Archie McLean into the care of his sister, and ensured the station was technically open, by leaving lugs to guard the front door, the village of Lochdubh was humming like a disturbed beehive. The rain had settled into a persistent, miserable drizzle that clung to, the wool of Hamish's sweater, but the damp did little to dampen the fires of local speculation. To the outside world, Hamish looked like a man defeated, a lowly constable sent away with his tail between his legs by the superior might of the Strathbane CID. In reality, being banished by Blair was the most liberating thing that could have happened to his investigation. He made his first stop at the general store, not to buy provisions, but because Mrs. Kennedy's shop was the central nervous system of the village's information network. If a stranger so much as sneezed on the road to Ullapool, Mrs. Kennedy knew the brand of their handkerchief. The bell above the door gave a cheerful ting as Hamish stepped inside, shaking the water from his cap. The air smelled of floor wax, peppermint, and the faint, briny scent of the nearby loch. "A terrible business, Hamish," Mrs. Kennedy said before he could even open his mouth. She was leaning over the counter, her eyes bright with the morbid excitement that only a local tragedy can provide. A stuffed fish, they're saying, and him head-first in a fountain like a common drunk. Though I suppose he was anything but common with that car and those airs. Hamish leaned against the counter, adopting his most leisurely posture. "Aye, it's a sad end for a man, Mrs. Kennedy, though I doubt the fish is feeling much of the insult. I don't suppose Mr. Vane was much of a regular here. He didn't seem the type for tinned beans and local gossip. Mrs. Kennedy sniffed, adjusting a pyramid of soup cans. "He came in once to complain that we didn't stock organic almond milk or some such nonsense. He had no patience for how we do things. But he wasn't alone in his troubles. He had a visitor yesterday afternoon, you know, a woman, none of us, mind you, dressed like she was heading for a garden party in London, despite the hair." Hamish tilted his head, his hazel eyes sharpening. "A woman, you say? Was she staying at the hotel?" "She was. A Mrs. Cynthia Vane, his ex-wife, or so she told Nellie at the reception. She came in here to buy a pack of cigarettes, the expensive kind, and spent 10 minutes complaining about the dampness of the air. She looked like she'd been carved out of ice and polished until she shone. Not a happy woman, Hamish. Not happy at all. Hamish nodded slowly, absorbing this. A bitter ex-wife was a classic motive, but it felt almost too neat for the theatrical display at the fountain. He thanked Mrs. Kennedy and wandered back out into the mist, his boots crunching on the wet gravel. He didn't head for the hotel yet. Instead, he made his way toward the waterfront, where the small, brightly painted houses huddled together against the wind. He stopped at a small cottage with a peeling blue door, the home of Patel, who ran the village's only takeaway and was a man who saw everyone who moved along the main road after dark. "Hamish, come in, Patel urged, ushering him into a kitchen that smelled gloriously of mint and coriander. "You look like a drowned rat. Tea? Or something stronger?" "Tea would be grand, Patel," Hamish said, settling into a chair that was dangerously close to a stack of cardboard cartons. "I'm looking for some clarity. Did you see any movement towards the Larches last night, after the pub closed?" Patel busied himself with the kettle, his face thoughtful. It was a busy night for the rain, but a quiet one for the road. "However, I did see the schoolteacher's car, Mr. Menzies, driving up that way around 11. He was moving slowly, no lights on until he hit the main track. I thought it was odd, him being a man of such regular habits." Hamish frowned. Harry Menzies was a quiet, unassuming man who taught the local children and spent his weekends birdwatching. He was the last person one would expect to be involved in a bizarre, fish-themed homicide. "Menzies? Are you sure, Patel?" "As sure as I am that my lamb korma is the best in the Highlands," Patel replied, handing Hamish a steaming mug. But there was something else, a noise, not a car, but a high-pitched whirring, like a toy or a drone. It came from the direction of the house just before midnight. Hamish thought of the tiny yellow plastic he had seen in the garden. A drone in Lochdubh? It was a piece of technology that felt as out of place as Julian Vane himself. He sipped his tea, the warmth spreading through his chest, and began to piece together a map of the village's evening. An ex-wife at the hotel, a school teacher in the dark, and a mechanical whirring in the night. As he left Patel's cottage, he saw the black sedan of DCI Blair roar past the end of the street, likely heading back to the hotel to bully the staff. Blair would be looking for a smoking gun or a blood-stained shirt. He wouldn't be thinking about the schoolteacher's car or the significance of a child's toy. Hamish knew he needed to speak to Harry Menzies, but he also knew that the social heart of the mystery likely lay with the aristocracy. He began the long walk up toward the Halberton Smythe estate. Priscilla would be there, and Priscilla moved in circles that Julian Vane had desperately tried to penetrate. She would know the social cost of Vane's arrival, and, more importantly, she would know who in the village had the most to lose from Vane's modernization plans. The investigation was widening, moving away from the cold marble of the fountain and into the warm, cluttered parlours of the living. Hamish felt the familiar pull of the chase. Not the loud, aggressive pursuit favoured by the CID, but the quiet, patient stalking of a man who knew exactly where the deer would break cover. He just had to make sure he didn't look too successful, or Blair might actually start paying attention to him. And that, in Hamish's mind, would be the true tragedy of the day. He adjusted his cap, whistled a low, mournful tune, and disappeared into the thickening fog of the afternoon. The walk up to the Halberton Smythe estate was a long, lung-stretching climb that Hamish usually negotiated with a series of strategically timed pauses to admire the view, though today the view was little more than various shades of wet wool. By the time he reached the great stone gates of the big house, his boots were caked in peat and his thoughts were as tangled as the briars along the path. He needed more than just village gossip. He needed the perspective of someone who understood the intricate, often suffocating social layers of the Highlands. He needed Priscilla. Priscilla Halberton Smythe was the daughter of the local laird, a woman of striking beauty and an even more striking intellect that she often kept tucked away behind a mask of cool, aristocratic composure. Hamish's feelings for her were a messy knot of longing and frustration, but in matters of the law, she was his most reliable sounding board. He found her in the morning room, surrounded by stacks of old ledgers and a silver tea service that gleamed despite the gloom outside. She looked up as he entered, her blue eyes narrowing at the sight of his sodden state. "You look like something the lock brought in, Hamish," she said, though there was a hint of a smile at the corner of her mouth. "I take it you've been at the Larches. The news has already reached the Colonel. He's currently in the gun room, oscillating between horror at the murder and outrage that someone stole his favourite trophy salmon from the hotel bar." Hamish sank into a delicate velvet chair that groaned under his weight. "So it was the Colonel's fish. I thought it looked familiar. It's a cruel thing to do to a man's pride, Priscilla, and even crueler to the fish. But it's not the fish that's bothering me. It's the way Vaughn was left. It was a performance." Priscilla poured him a cup of tea, the liquid dark and strong. Julian Vaughn was a performance himself, Hamish. He didn't just want to buy property, he wanted to buy status. He spent his first week here trying to bulldoze his way into the local hunt, and his second week threatening to sue the council over the ancient right-of-way that crosses his north paddock. He was an irritant to everyone, from the Duke down to the dustman. Mrs. Kennedy mentioned an ex-wife, Hamish noted, blowing on his tea. "Cynthia Vane, she's staying at the hotel. Do you know her?" Priscilla nodded, leaning back. "I saw her briefly at the hotel's charity auction last night. She's brittle, Hamish. The divorce was famously litigious. Vane apparently kept the Porsche and the London flat, leaving her with a dwindling settlement and a great deal of resentment. She arrived 2 days ago, ostensibly to reason with him about some shared investments. But I overheard them arguing in the hotel lounge on Monday. He told her she was a dinosaur and that he was moving on to bigger and better things, like turning our village hall into a gin palace." Hamish asked dryly. "Exactly, but there's something else you should know." 5th. Ain wasn't just fighting with his ex-wife. He had been having a rather public row with Harry Menzies, the schoolteacher. It was not about Village Hall. It was about the old bird sanctuary on the cliffs. Vane wanted to clear the gorse to improve his view of the loch, and Harry, well, you know Harry, he treats those nesting puffins like they're his own children. Hamish thought of the small yellow plastic fragment in his pocket, and the whirring noise Patel had described. Would Harry use a drone to watch those birds, Priscilla? Or perhaps to watch a man who was threatening them? Priscilla's expression shifted, a flicker of concern crossing her face. "Harry is a gentle soul, Hamish, but even the gentlest creature will bite if you corner it. He's been distraught. He told me last week that Vane was a canker on the soul of the Highlands. It was uncharacteristically dark for him, but surely you don't think Harry could—" "The fish, Hamish. The fish is so petty. It's the pettiness that worries me," Hamish said, staring into the depths of his teacup. "Blair is looking for a grand motive. Money, power, professional rivalry. He's up there now, probably tearing Vane's office apart looking for a secret ledger. But I keep thinking about those missing shoelaces and that toy piece. It feels like someone was trying to make Julian Vane look small, not just dead, but ridiculous." Priscilla went to the window, watching the rain lash against the glass. "If you want to understand why Vane was regretted that way, you have to look at who he humiliated. He had a habit of treating people like they were part of the scenery. He called Archie MacLean a slow-witted peasant to his face in front of the whole pub. He told the minister that the church was a drain on the local economy. He made everyone feel insignificant, and when a man makes everyone feel small, someone eventually decides to return the favour. Hamish finished for her. He stood up, feeling the dampness of his trousers beginning to itch. "I need to find Harry Menzies, and I need to find out why a man with no children had a piece of a yellow plastic toy in his garden." "Be careful, Hamish," Priscilla said softly, her hand resting briefly on his arm. "Blair's looking for a scapegoat, and if he finds out you're investigating behind his back, he'll have your badge. He's already told the Colonel that the local police are a hindrance to the investigation." "Blair couldn't find his own backside with both hands and a map," Hamish muttered, though he appreciated the warning. He looked at Priscilla, seeing the genuine worry in her eyes, and for a moment the mystery of Julian Vane felt very far away. But then Luggs let out a sharp bark from the hallway, reminding him that he was still a man on duty, however much he wished otherwise. He left the big house with more questions than he had arrived with. The ex-wife had the motive of money and spite. The schoolteacher had the motive of passion and protection. Both were Outsiders in their own way, but the crime felt rooted in the very dirt of Lochdubh. As he descended the hill toward the village, the fog seemed to thicken, swallowing the houses and the harbour, until only the yellow glow of the street lamps remained. He knew where he had to go next. He had to visit the schoolhouse, not as a policeman with a warrant, but as a neighbour looking for a bit of bird-watching advice. If Harry Menzies was hiding something, it wouldn't be in a safe or a secret drawer, it would be hidden in the things he wasn't saying. And Hamish Macbeth was a master of listening to the silence. The descent from the Halberton Smythe estate felt steeper in the thickening gloom, the mud pulling at Hamish's boots as if the Highland earth itself were trying to slow his progress. His conversation with Priscilla provided the social skeleton of the case, but he still lacked the meat of it. He could hear the distant, rhythmic thumping of a generator from the direction of the larches, a sign that Blair's team was settling in for a long night of fruitless forensic dusting. Hamish, however, turned away from the bright lights of the crime scene and headed toward the outskirts of the village, where the schoolhouse sat nestled against a stand of ancient, dripping larches. Harry Menzies was a man of predictable rhythms, yet as Hamish approached the gate, he noticed a startling break in that routine. Usually the schoolteacher's windows were a warm glow of yellow light by 5 o'clock, illuminating the silhouettes of his many bird-tracking charts. Tonight the house was entirely dark. Only a thin, hesitant plume of smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting a fire that had been neglected. Hamish pushed the gate open. The rusted hinges let out a mournful shriek that seemed to hang in the damp air. Luggs paused, his hackles rising slightly, his sensitive ears pivoting toward the back of the property. Hamish didn't knock immediately. Instead, he wandered toward the side of the house, his eyes scanning the ground. Near the shed where Harry kept his binoculars and seed bags, the grass was flattened in a strange, circular pattern, and there, caught in the thorns of a nearby gorse bush, was a familiar sight, a tangled mess of thin nylon fishing line, the very kind the Colonel used for his fly fishing. Hamish reached out, untangling a few inches of it, and felt the distinct weight of something mechanical having been attached to it. He thought back to Patel's mention of a whirring drone and the yellow plastic fragment in the garden. The pieces were beginning to rattle together in his mind, though the picture they formed was increasingly tragic. A floorboard creaked inside the house. Hamish stepped back onto the porch and gave a firm, slow knock. "Harry, it's Hamish Macbeth. I was wondering if you might have a moment for a neighbourly word. The rain's a bit much for standing on ceremony." There was a long silence, punctuated only by the drip of water from the eaves. Final lie. The lock turned with a heavy thud. Harry Menzies stood in the doorway, looking like he had aged a decade since Sunday. His wool cardigan was buttoned incorrectly, and his eyes, usually bright with the excitement of a rare sighting, were bloodshot and hollow. He didn't invite Hamish, but he didn't close the door either. "It's a terrible business about Mr. Vane, isn't it, Harry?" Hamish began softly, leaning against the door frame to appear as non-threatening as possible. "The village is all a chatter. DCI Blair is up there now, looking for someone to blame. He's got it into his head that it was a property dispute. He's looking for someone with a grudge." Harry's hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the door. Vane was a man who didn't understand the value of things that can't be bought, Hamish. He wanted to destroy the nesting grounds. He laughed when I told him about the razorbills. He called them flying rats. He was an unkind man, certainly, Hamish agreed, his voice dropping to a confidential whisper. But Blair doesn't care about kindness. He's looking for fingerprints. He's looking for the person who put that stuffed salmon in the fountain. It's a very specific kind of insult, Harry. It's the kind of thing someone might do if they wanted to prove that nature and the village always gets the last word. Harry looked away, his gaze fixed on the dark silhouettes of the mountains. "I went there last night, Hamish. I won't lie to you. I went to talk to him. One last time. I wanted to show him the footage from my drone, to show him the beauty of what he was planning to bulldoze. I thought if he saw the birds from the air, he might understand." Hamish felt a cold prickle of realization. And did he understand, Harry? "He didn't even listen," Harry whispered, his voice breaking. He grabbed the drone out of the air. He smashed it against the fountain. "He was laughing, Hamish. He told me to get off his land or he'd have me arrested for trespassing. He was so full of himself. He didn't see the ice on the marble. He slipped, he fell backward into the fountain, and his head hit the edge of the Neptune statue. I heard it, a sound like a dry branch snapping. Hamish remained perfectly still. And then, Harry? I panicked. I saw him lying there, and I thought no one would believe it was an accident, not after I'd been shouting at him in the street for weeks. I saw the drone lying in pieces, yellow plastic everywhere. I tried to clean it up, but I couldn't find it all in the dark. And then I saw the fish. It was in the back of his car. He'd stolen it from the hotel as a souvenir, he told me earlier that day. He thought it was a joke. I was so angry, Hamish. Even with him dead, I was so angry at his arrogance. I took the fish and I did it to shame him. I wanted him to look as ridiculous as he made everyone else feel. The confession hung in the air, heavy and pathetic. It wasn't the cold-blooded murder Blair was Sally waiting for. It was a moment of accidental tragedy, followed by a flurry of human spite. But as Hamish looked at the broken man before him, he knew Blair would never see it that way. Blair would see a motive, a confrontation, and a body. He would see a career-making arrest. "Harry," Hamish said, his voice firm but not unkind, "Blair is going to find the rest of that drone. He's going to find the missing shoelaces you used to tie the drone's camera to your line, and he's going to find the scuff marks from your boots. You can't stay here." "I killed him, Hamish," Harry said. "I didn't mean to, but he's dead because of me. It was an accident, Harry. But in Blair's world there are no accidents, only suspects." Hamish looked back toward the village, where the blue lights of a patrol car were beginning to move. Blair was on the hunt, and the obvious suspect, the man with the loudest grudge, was now squarely in his sights. Hamish knew he had to act quickly, not to hide the truth, but to ensure that the truth didn't get twisted into a life sentence for a man who had only wanted to save the birds. He needed a red herring, and he needed it before Blair reached the schoolhouse gate. He reached into his pocket and felt the yellow plastic fragment. The trap was beginning to form, but it wasn't for Harry. It was for the man who was currently shouting orders at the larches. Hamish had to lead the hounds away from the fox, and he knew exactly which scent they would follow if he laid the trail correctly. He turned back to Harry, his eyes hard. "Go inside, clean your boots, burn that cardigan, and for the love of the Highlands, don't say another word to anyone until I come back for you." As Hamish left the trembling schoolteacher behind, the fog seemed to thicken into a physical weight, pressing against his chest. He had the truth now, or at least a version of it that made a tragic human kind of sense. Julian Vane's death hadn't been a calculated execution. It had been a moment of high-tension slapstick turned fatal, a collision of London arrogance and Highland stubbornness on a slippery marble rim. But Hamish knew the law as interpreted by DCI Blair was a blunt instrument. If Blair found Harry Menzies now, the schoolteacher would be pulverized by the system, his life ended by an accidental slip, and a moment of post-mortem pique involving a taxidermied fish. Hamish walked toward the village centre, his mind whirring faster than Harry's ill-fated drone. He needed to broaden the scope of the suspicion. He needed to remind everyone, especially the red-faced DCI, that Julian Vane had a trail of victims stretching far beyond the bird sanctuaries of Lochdubh. Specifically, he needed to look closer at the brittle woman Priscilla had described. If Harry was the petty motive of the moment, Cynthia Vane was the long-standing grudge of a lifetime. He made his way to the Lochdubh Hotel, a sturdy granite building that looked like it had been designed to withstand a siege. The lobby was uncharacteristically crowded. Reporters from the Strathbane Press were already huddled in the corner, and a few uniformed officers were standing by the bar, looking longingly at the whiskey pumps. Hamish slipped past them, his tall frame blending into the shadows of the wood-panelled hallway. He didn't have to look far for Cynthia Vane. She was seated in a secluded alcove near the fire, a glass of clear gin in one hand and a long, slim cigarette in the other. She was exactly as Mrs. Kennedy had described, polished, cold, and entirely out of place. Her blonde hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to sharpen her features into a series of elegant knives. As Hamish approached, she didn't look up, but her hand tightened on the stem of her glass. "If you're here to ask for a statement, Constable, I've already given one to the loud man with the unfortunate complexion," she said, her voice a clipped, London drawl. DCI Blair has a way of making an impression, to be sure, Hamish said, pulling out a chair and sitting without being asked. He placed his wet cap on the table between them. But I'm not here for a formal statement. I'm just a local man wondering why a woman who hated her husband enough to fight him for 3 years in court would travel 500 miles just to watch him buy a house in a swamp. Cynthia Vane finally turned her gaze toward him. Her eyes were a pale, watery blue. Julian didn't just buy a house, Constable. He bought it with my money. Or rather, the money he hid in offshore accounts during our amicable settlement. I came here to tell him I had found the paper trail. I came here to tell him that if he didn't settle the remaining $3 million, I would ensure his precious property empire collapsed like a house of cards. That's a lot of money, Hamish mused, watching the way the firelight played over her expensive jewelry. Enough to make a person angry. Angry enough to, say, follow him out into his garden and have a final heated argument by the fountain? Cynthia let out a sharp, brittle laugh. Is that the theory? That I pushed him? Julian was a fitness fanatic, Constable. He could have bench-pressed me with one hand. Besides, I have no interest in seeing him dead. Dead men don't pay settlements. I wanted him alive, miserable, and writing checks. And the fish? Hamish asked softly. Did you want him looking like a fool with a trophy salmon in his trousers? For the first time, a flicker of genuine confusion crossed her face. The fish was an absurdity, typical of this place. If I were going to kill Julian, I would have done it with a ledger and a lawyer, not a piece of dusty taxidermy. But I suppose your DCI friend prefers it more theatrical explanation. He spent an hour accusing me of hiring a local hitman, as if there's anyone in this village capable of following a map, let alone a contract. Hamish didn't take offence. He merely absorbed the information. Cynthia had the motive of money, but she lacked the local knowledge of the fish's significance. More importantly, she had confirmed something vital. Vane had been desperate. If he was hiding money, he was also hiding his vulnerabilities. As he left the hotel, Hamish felt the pieces of the puzzle shifting again. He had Harry's confession of an accident, but he also had the shadow of a much larger, more professional malice. If Vane was hiding £3 million, perhaps someone else had been looking for it too. Someone who knew the village, knew the hotel, and knew that a death looking like a local prank would be the perfect way to distract the police while they went through Vane's hidden assets. He stopped at the edge of the pier, looking out at the dark water, the missing shoelaces, the yellow plastic, the stuffed salmon. Blair was focusing on the who, but Hamish was focusing on the why now. Why did Vane have the fish in his car in the first place? Harry said Vane had stolen it as a souvenir, but that didn't fit the character of a man who only valued what was expensive and new. Sudden, sharp memory surfaced in Hamish's mind, a bit of village gossip from months ago. The Colonel's trophy fish hadn't just been a decoration, it had been a hollowed-out piece of history rumoured to have been used during the war to hide messages. If Vane had stolen it, he hadn't done it for a laugh. He did it because it was a container. "Aye, lugs," Hamish whispered to the dog, who had reappeared from the darkness of the harbour. "It's not just a murder, it's a hunt. And the prize isn't in the fountain, it's whatever was inside that wooden belly." He realised then that Harry Menzies might have been a witness to more than just his own misfortune. If someone else had been there, someone lurking in the shadows while Harry fled, they would have seen Vane fall. They would have seen the opportunity to retrieve the fish and finish the job of making it look like a local's revenge. The undercurrent of darkness was pulling him deeper, and Hamish knew that to save Harry he would have to prove that the accident had been witnessed by a predator. He turned his collar up against the wind and headed back toward the station. He had a plan to set, and it would require every bit of his lazy reputation on to pull it off. He needed Blair to think he had failed, and he needed the killer to think they had won. But first he needed to find out who else in Lochdubh knew the secret of the Colonel's salmon. The damp chill of the harbour air seemed to seep into Hamish's very bones as he made his way back toward the centre of Lochdubh. The information about the Colonel's trophy salmon was the final thread in a very tangled weave. If that fish was more than just a dusty relic, if it had been a vessel for something valuable, then the entire scene at the fountain took on a more sinister light. Harry Menzies had confessed to a moment of panicked spite, but Hamish's intuition, honed by years of watching the subtle shifts in village life, told him that a second shadow had been moving in the darkness of the larches. Someone had watched the accident, waited for the distraught schoolteacher to flee, and then stepped in to finish a very different kind of business. Hamish knew that to catch a fox, one had to make the fox believe the hounds were miles away. He needed to play the part of the defeated, incompetent constable to perfection. He headed straight for the Lochdubh Hotel's bar, knowing that DCI Blair would likely be there, holding court and nursing a large whiskey, while his subordinates did the actual work of cataloguing Julian Vane's designer suits. As he pushed through the heavy oak doors, the warmth of the peat fire and the smell of stale beer greeted him. Blair was indeed there, his face now a shade of crimson that rivaled a sunset over the Quillins. He was shouting into a mobile phone, but he paused long enough to sneer as Hamish approached the bar. "Back for a liquid supper, Macbeth?" Blair barked, slamming his phone onto the table. "I hope you've enjoyed your little wander around the village. My team has actually found something useful while you were out mooching tea. We've found the motive. Vane was being blackmailed. We found a series of anonymous emails on his laptop demanding £500,000 to keep quiet about some shady offshore dealings. I've got a list of names, and I'm starting with the schoolteacher. He's been seen acting like a man with a guilty conscience." Hamish leaned heavily against the bar, looking like he might fall asleep on his feet. He caught the bartender's eye and pointed to a ginger ale. "Blackmail, sir? That sounds very complicated for a place like this. And here I was thinking it was just a bit of local friction over a bird sanctuary. Harry Menzies is a nervous man by nature, sir. He'd look guilty if he forgot to return a library book." "Don't tell me how to do my job," Blair snapped, his eyes bulging. "The schoolteacher had the motive, he had the opportunity, and he's currently hiding in his house with the lights off. I'm going to arrest him at dawn. It'll be tidy, close to a messy case, and I can get out of this godforsaken rain." Hamish took a slow sip of his drink, his expression one of vacant agreement. "Well, you're he expert, sir. It's a shame about the fish. I was talking to the postmistress, and she was saying it's a pity the true reward was lost. She seemed to think the fish was a sort of local mascot, you see. Apparently, whoever finds the hidden belly of the salmon gets a prize from the colonel himself." He felt a sudden, sharp stillness in the corner of the room. It wasn't Blair who reacted. The DCI was too busy basking in his own perceived brilliance, but someone else. Near the far end of the bar sat a man who had remained largely invisible until now, Peter Snell, the estate manager for a neighbouring property who had been helping Julian Vane with his land acquisitions. Snell was a quiet, efficient man, with the watchful eyes of a hawk. He didn't move, but the knuckles on the hand holding his glass turned white. "The hidden belly?" Blair scoffed. "What are you talking about, you Highland simpleton?" "Oh, it's just an old village story, sir," Hamish said, waving a hand dismissively. "The fish was hollowed out years ago to hide a bottle of rare malt for the colonel's jubilee. They say the bottle is still there, hidden behind a false plate in the wood. It's probably worth a fortune to a collector now. But since the fish is in your evidence locker, I suppose the secret stays with the police." Hamish watched out of the corner of his eye. Peter Snell set his glass down and stood up, moving toward the door with a hurried, practiced grace. He didn't look back. Hamish knew E-trap had been baited. He had just told a greedy man that the prize he had likely been searching for, the 3 million Cynthia Vane had mentioned, might still be inside the very object that had been used to humiliate the victim. "I'm going back to the station, sir," Hamish said to Blair, who was already ignoring him again. "Luggs needs his walk, and I've got a pot of stew waiting. If you need me for the arrest in the morning, I'll be ready. Just stay out of the way, Macbeth," Blair muttered. "That's the best service you can provide the Crown." Hamish tipped his cap and stepped out into the night. The rain had finally ceased, leaving behind a cold, biting wind that whistled through the riggings of the boats in the harbour. He didn't go back to the station. Instead, he whistled for Luggs and began a brisk, silent climb toward the village schoolhouse. He knew he didn't have much time. If Snell believed there was something valuable still inside that fish, he wouldn't go to the police evidence locker. He would realize that Hamish had likely misplaced the fish during the initial discovery, or that it had been moved. But Hamish had another card to play. He had left the stuffed salmon exactly where Blair's men had bagged it, but he had spread a very specific rumour earlier in the evening while mooching at the post office. He had told Mrs. Kennedy that he'd found a second fish at the schoolhouse, a matching pair that Vane had supposedly been obsessed with. It was a lie, of course, but it was a lie designed to draw the predator to a specific location. He reached the schoolhouse and found Harry Menzies sitting in the dark, just as he had left him. "Harry," Hamish whispered, entering through the back door, "I need you to go to the station, take lugs, lock the door and don't open it for anyone but me, not even DCI Blair." "What's happening, Hamish?" Harry asked, his voice trembling. "I'm setting a stage, Harry, and I need the leading man to show his face." Hamish waited until Harry and the dog had disappeared into the shadows of the trees before he set to work. He moved into the small garden shed where he had found the fishing line earlier. He took a heavy wooden log from the woodpile and wrapped it in an old piece of burlap, shaping it to roughly the size of a large fish. He placed it on the workbench, partially obscured by a tarp, and left a single dim flashlight nearby, its beam hitting the edge of the burlap just enough to catch the eye of anyone peering through the window. Then, Hamish climbed into the loft of the shed, settling himself among the dusty gardening tools and bags of peat. He didn't have to wait long. The Highland night was silent, but for the occasional groan of the trees. After 20 minutes, the sound of a car engine approaching, driven slowly with the lights extinguished, broke the stillness. A door creaked open, then closed with a soft click. Footsteps approached the shed, cautious and light. A figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the pale moonlight. It was Peter Snell. He was carrying a heavy crowbar and a pair of industrial gloves. He didn't look like a man interested in bird-watching. He looked like a man who had spent his life taking what he wanted from those too weak to stop him. He moved straight for the workbench, his eyes locked on the burlap-wrapped shape. "Where is it, you ginger bastard?" Snell muttered under his breath, his voice devoid of its usual professional polish. He reached for the burlap, his hands trembling with a frantic, greedy energy. He tore the cloth away, only to find the rough, uncarved wood of a fireplace log. "It's a bit dry for a salmon, wouldn't you say, Peter?" Hamish's voice drifted from the loft, calm and cold. Snell spun around, the crowbar raised, his face twisted into a mask of pure rage. "Macbeth, I should have known you were playing a game. Where is the real one? Where is the fish Vane took? He told me he'd hidden the account keys inside it. He was going to cut me out. Me, the man who did all the legwork for his dirty land deals." "He fell, Peter," Hamish said, slowly descending the ladder, his eyes never leaving the other man. "Harry saw him fall. But you were there too, weren't you? You watched from the trees. You waited for Harry to leave, then saw your chance. You didn't help him, you just wanted the keys. But the fountain was dry, and the fish was empty, wasn't it? Vane had already moved the keys. So you shoved the fish back in his trousers to muck. It looked like a local grudge, hoping the police would spend all their time hounding the villagers while you searched the house." Snell took a step forward, his knuckles white on the crowbar. "He was a dead man anyway. I just gave the story a better ending. Now you're going to tell me where that fish is, or I'm going to make sure the next body they find in a fountain is wearing a silver-buttoned uniform." Hamish didn't flinch. He was a tall man, and though he preferred the path of least resistance, he was built of Highland granite and iron. "The fish is in the evidence locker, Peter, and so is the tiny yellow plastic tail from your drone, the one you used to spy on Vane to make sure he wasn't cheating you. You dropped it when you were mocking the body. It's funny, the things people leave behind when they're in a hurry to be clever." With a roar of frustration, Snell lunged, the crowbar swinging in a deadly arc. Hamish stepped aside with a grace that would have shocked DCI Blair, his hand shooting out to catch Snell's wrist. The struggle was brief but brutal, a tangle of limbs and shadows in the cramped shed. Hamish used the momentum of Snell's own greed against him, twisting the man's arm back until the crowbar clattered to the floor. With a sharp, well-placed shove, Hamish sent the estate manager crashing into a stack of heavy peat bags. Before Snell could recover, Hamish was on him, pinning his arms with the calm, practiced ease of a man who had wrestled more than a few unruly rams in his time. "It's over, Peter," Hamish said, his voice barely raised above a whisper. "The only prize you're getting tonight is a ride to Strathbane, and I think you'll find the cells there are much less comfortable than the larches." As the sound of the struggle faded, Hamish looked out the shed door. In the distance he could see the lights of a patrol car, Blair, finally following the trail of the suspicious vehicle Hamish had called in anonymously. The trap was sprung, the killer was caught, and now came the hardest part of all, making sure he didn't get any of the credit. He sighed, adjusting his crumpled tunic. He had a very tall tale to tell the DCI, and it would have to be his best performance yet. He needed to look like a man who had stumbled into a lucky arrest while looking for a lost sheep. Or his quiet life in Lochdubh was as dead as Julian Vane. The crunch of gravel and the flash of blue lights against the wet gorse signalled the arrival of Strathbane police. Hamish stood in the doorway of the shed, his breath hitching in the cold air as he maintained a firm grip on the collar of Peter Snell's jacket. Snell was no longer the composed, arrogant estate manager. He was a heap of trembling resentment, his face smeared with peat dust and his eyes darting toward the darkness of the woods, as if he could still find a way to vanish into the heather. Hamish, however, had already adopted his mask of rural bewilderment. He looked at the approaching headlights with the expression of a man who had gone out for a pint of milk and accidentally discovered a new continent. DCI Blair was the first out of the car, his shoes squelching into the mud with a sound that clearly heralded a fresh wave of fury. Behind him, Sergeant Anderson was trying to keep a flashlight steady while simultaneously shielding himself from the renewed drizzle. Blair marched up to the shed, his face illuminated by the harsh strobe-like flicker of the patrol car's lights. He stopped short at the sight of Hamish Macbeth holding the pinned and disgruntled Snell. "What in the name of the Holy Rood is going on here, Macbeth?" Blair bellowed, his voice cracking with the strain of his own blood pressure. "I was on my way to arrest the schoolteacher for the murder of Julian Vane, and I got a frantic call about a suspicious intruder at the schoolhouse. And now I find you here, playing at being a bouncer for a potting shed." Hamish blinked, his eyes wide and vacant. "Oh, sir, thank goodness you've arrived. It was the most extraordinary thing. I was just out for a bit of a stroll with Lugs, the dog needed the air, you see, when I saw Mr. Snell here sneaking around the back of the schoolhouse. I thought to myself, Hamish, that's not right. Mr. Snell is a busy man, what's he doing in a shed at this hour? So I followed him in, thinking maybe he'd lost his car keys, and he attacked me with a crowbar. I was terrified, sir. I just fell on him and we ended up in the peat bags. As a terrible struggle, Snell let out a muffled snarl of protest. "He's lying. He set me up. He told me there were keys in the fish. He lured me here." Blair ignored Snell entirely, his gaze fixing on the crowbar lying on the dirt floor. "Lured you? To a schoolhouse shed? Why would you be looking for keys in a fish, you idiot? And why would you be looking for them here?" "That's what I asked him, sir," Hamish added helpfully, his voice rising in an imitation of high-pitched anxiety. But then he started shouting all sorts of things about Mr. Vane. He said he saw the accident, he said he watched the poor man fall, and then waited for the witness to leave so he could search the body for some sort of offshore account codes. It was quite shocking. He even admitted to shoving the Colonel's salmon down the deceased's trousers, just to make us think it was a local prank. He said he wanted us stupid police to be distracted by the villagers while he ransacked the house. Can you imagine that cheek? Calling you stupid? Blair's face underwent a rapid transformation, moving from a deep crimson to a shade of eggplant that suggested a looming medical emergency. Insulting his professional dignity was the final catalyst. He entered the shed, looming over the pinned Snell. Called us stupid, did he? Thought he could play the Strathbane CID for fools while he played scavenger at a crime scene? "He did indeed, sir," Hamish whispered, looking properly scandalized. "He even said he used a drawn to spy on Mr. Vane. I think I saw a piece of it earlier, a yellow tail fin. I thought it was a bit of rubbish, but Mr. Snell here seemed very concerned that the police might find it. He was quite desperate to get it back." "Anderson," Blair barked, not even looking back at his sergeant. "Cuff him. Now. And get the forensics team here. I want every inch of this shed searched. If there's a drone or a ledger or a single strand of this man's hair in that garden, I want it bagged and tagged." As Anderson stepped forward to take custody of Snell, Hamish slowly released his grip and stepped back into the shadows, wiping his hands on his trousers. He looked every bit the shaken, accidental hero. "I'm just glad you were nearby, sir. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't arrived to take charge. My heart is going like a rabbit's." Blair puffed out his chest. The prospect of a high-profile arrest, one involving offshore accounts and corporate espionage, completely erasing his desire to arrest the lowly schoolteacher. Yes, well, it's lucky for you I have a nose for these things, Macbeth. I knew there was something more to this than a simple village grudge. I had my suspicions about Snell early. The man was half smooth. It takes a certain level of intellect to see through a cover story like his. It does indeed, sir, Hamish agreed humbly. I would never have thought of it myself. I was just worried about the crowbar. Go home, Macbeth, Blair said, waving a hand dismissively, as he began to direct Anderson on how to properly secure the prisoner. Go back to your dog and your stove. I'll handle the interrogation. This is a complex matter now. International finance, blackmail, the works. It's far beyond a village constable. I'll be taking all the evidence back to Strathbane tonight. Of course, sir. Whatever you say is best. I'll just go and see if I can find my dog. He ran off when the shouting started. Hamish turned and walked away from the shed, his pace slow and steady. Once he was out of the glare of the police lights, the frightened slump in his shoulders vanished. He navigated the dark path back toward the police station, his mind already turning toward the next move. He had successfully shifted the target from Harry Menzies to Peter Snell. While Snell hadn't technically pushed Vane, his admitted presence at the scene, his failure to render aid, his tampering with a corpse, and his clear motive of blackmail would be more than enough to keep Blair's career ambitions satisfied for months. More importantly, it meant that the accident would be buried under a mountain of much more impressive-sounding crimes. He found Harry and Luggs waiting inside the station. The schoolteacher was sitting at the kitchen table, a half-empty mug of cold tea in front of him. He looked up with a desperate hope as Hamish entered. "It's over, Harry," Hamish said, his voice returning to its soft, confident lilt. "Blair has his man. Peter Snell is currently being itted for a set of Strathbane's finest steel bracelets. He's confessed to enough to ensure that nobody is going to be looking at bird watchers or drones for a very long time." Harry let out a sob of pure relief, his head sinking into his hands. "But Hamish, the truth? What will happen to the truth? The truth is that an unkind man fell on the ice because he was too busy being cruel to see where he was stepping," Hamish said firmly. "And a greedy man tried to profit from it. That's all the truth the world needs, Harry. Now you're going to stay here tonight. Tomorrow you're going to go back to your birds, and you're going to forget you ever saw Julian Vane's fountain. Do you understand?" Harry nodded fervently. "I understand, Hamish. I do. I don't know how to thank you. You can thank me by never making me chase a drone through the gorse again," Hamish remarked, finally moving toward his stove. He felt a deep, hollow ache in his stomach. He hadn't eaten since the girls that morning, and the events of the evening had left him drained. He reached for a tin of stew in his favourite heavy pot. As the gas ring flickered to life, throwing a warm blue glow over the kitchen, Hamish felt the familiar peace of Lochdubh beginning to settle once more. The sirens were fading into the distance, carrying Blair and his prize away toward the city. The mystery of the Hearthside Enigma was solved, not by DNA or high-tech labs, but by the simple knowledge that a greedy man cannot resist a go. Eldon egg, even if the egg is a wooden fish. He leaned against the counter, listening to the rain start up again, a gentle rhythmic drumming on the roof that promised a quiet night. He had avoided promotion, saved a friend, and ensured that the village's secrets remained exactly where they belonged, in the silence between the mountains and the sea. He just had to make sure that when he saw Blair tomorrow, he remembered to look appropriately useless. It was, after all, his most important duty. The following morning, the sun broke through the highland mist with a rare, watery brilliance, casting long shadows across the village of Lochdubh. The roar of police engines had finally been replaced by the more civilized sounds of gulls crying over the harbour and the distant rhythmic clink of the milk float. Inside the police station, the air was thick with the scent of strong coffee and the lingering warmth of the peat stove. DCI Blair stood in the centre of the small office, his chest puffed out so far that his waistcoat buttons were under visible duress. He was clutching a thick stack of folders, looking like a man who had personally conquered a foreign nation. "Well, Macbeth," Blair barked, though for once his tone lacked its usual serrated edge, replaced instead by a smug, self-congratulatory vibrance. "We're heading back to Strathbane. Snell is singing like a canary." It turns out he had more than just a passing interest in Vane's offshore accounts. He'd been skimming off the development funds for years. When Vane found out, they had their confrontation. Snell claims it was an accident, that Vane slipped, but with the blackmail evidence and the tampering with the body, no jury in Scotland will give him the time of day. Hamish was slumped in his chair, his long legs stretched out toward the stove, looking as though he had barely managed to dress himself. He suppressed a yawn, his hazel eyes bleary. "It's a grand result, sir. Truly grand. The village will be talking about your brilliant deduction for years. How you saw right through that estate manager's polish." Blair preened, adjusting his tie in the reflection of the station's trophy cabinet. "It's a matter of experience, Macbeth. Something you'd understand if you ever had the ambition to leave this puddle of a village. I knew the moment I saw that fish that we were dealing with a mind that thought itself superior to the law. It took a professional to peel back the layers of local nonsense and find the corporate greed underneath." "Aye, sir." "A professional touch," Hamish murmured. "And what about the schoolteacher, Mr. Menzies? I suppose he's no longer of interest to the Crown?" Blair waved a dismissive hand. "A nervous little man, he was clearly just a victim of Vane's bullying. I've decided not to press charges for his presence at the scene. It would only clutter a perfectly clean case against Snell. No, I've got my man, and I've got the motive. I'll be mentioning the efficient cooperation of local station in my report. But let's be honest, Macbeth. It was the CID that cracked this one. I wouldn't have it any other way, sir," Hamish said, his voice a model of humble sincerity. "In fact, if you could just leave my name out of the headlines. The locals here, they get a bit twitchy if they think I'm getting too big for my boots. I'd much rather the credit went where it's deserved, up the ladder, so to speak." Blair let out a sharp, barking laugh and clapped Hamish on the shoulder with enough force to rattle his teeth. "You've got no spark, Macbeth, no drive, but at least you know your place. Very well, I'll take the brunt of the publicity. Someone has to deal with the press, after all." With a final imperious nod, Blair turned and marched out of the station. Hamish watched from the window as the black sedan sped away, followed by the last of the forensic vans. The silence that followed was heavy and sweet, the true peace of the Highlands returning as if it had never been disturbed. A few minutes later, the back door creaked open. Priscilla Halberton Smythe stepped into the kitchen, looking as elegant as ever in a Barber jacket and silk scarf. She looked at the empty coffee pot and then at Hamish, who had already begun to settle back into his chair with the contented sigh of a man who had escaped a death sentence. "So," she said, her blue eyes dancing with amusement, "DCI Blair is the hero of the hour. The school teacher is safely back in his bird sanctuary, and D. Peter Snell is going to prison for a crime he only half committed. You've managed to tidy up a murder, save a friend, and avoid a promotion all in 24 hours, Hamish." Hamish shrugged, reaching for a small yellow piece of plastic he had kept in his pocket, the tail fin of the drone. He tossed it into the back of a drawer. "It's all about balance, Priscilla. Julian Vane was an unkind man who died by his own arrogance. Peter Snell was a greedy man who tried to hide the truth for a profit. And Harry Menzies is a good man who made a foolish mistake. The law doesn't always have room for those kinds of distinctions, so I just help the law find its way." "And the Colonel's fish?" she asked, leaning against the counter. "My father is still convinced there was a secret compartment." Hamish smiled, a slow, secretive thing. He reached into the bread bin and pulled out a small, heavy silver key that he had found lodged in the gravel of the fountain before the police arrived, a key that Snell had missed in his blind, panicked greed. "Let's just say that some secrets are better left at the bottom of the loch. I'll be returning this to the Colonel later, as a found item from the garden. No need to tell him what it opens. It'll give him something to wonder about over his whiskey for the next decade." Priscilla shook her head, a smile tugging at her lips. "You're a devious man, Hamish Macbeth. I'm a lazy man, Priscilla, and being devious is the only way to ensure I stay that way." As Priscilla left, promising to send over some of the cook's fresh venison pie, Hamish finally picked up his favourite pot and began to brew a fresh batch of coffee. The village was quiet, the mountains were clear, the Sassenach developer was gone, and the dark undercurrent that had threatened to pull Lochdubh under had receded back into the depths. He sat by the window, Lugs resting his heavy head on Hamish's knee. The Highland rain began to fall again, a soft musical patter against the glass. But inside the station, the stove was humming and the coffee was hot. Hamish closed his eyes, a small, satisfied smile on his face. He was exactly where he wanted to be, and for now, that was enough mystery for any man.